Ursula Probst is a social and cultural anthropologist and postdoctoral research associate at the Institute of Social and Cultural Anthropology at Freie Universität Berlin and currently a visiting scholar at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa. In her work, she is interested in questions of health and labor migration, gender and sexuality, as well as processes of racialization in Europe. Currently, she is doing ethnographic research on the pandemic experiences of truck drivers, construction workers, and market vendors in Germany. But before that, she was working on the experiences of migrant sex workers from the east of Europe in Berlin, which is the basis of her presentation today. She has done an amazing work, and I can promise it will be a fantastic talk.
Hello, do you hear me there?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, hello everyone from Johannesburg. I deeply regret not being able to be with you there in person today, but I'm very thankful for the invitation and for accommodating my physical absence. My talk today addresses the racialization of Eastern European migrants in the sex industry in Germany, and how these experiences of sex workers from the east of Europe are embedded in larger racialized hierarchies in the German labor market. As the topic of sex work is highly polarized, I would like to start with a note on terminology. I use the term sex work to highlight the connections between the sex industry and labor markets. This choice also reflects the fact that all my participants of my research described this activity as work, meaning that also for them there was a connection between offering sex for money and questions of employment and income generation. That does not mean, however, that they or I understand sex work as a necessarily good job. On the contrary, for most participants, it was a precarious job, which, however, was merely one of many precarious jobs they found themselves delegated to as Eastern Europeans in the German labor market. Okay. First, for some context. For those who don't know, sex work is legal and regulated in Germany and mostly practiced as a form of self-employment, which means that sex workers are not automatically included in health insurance and social welfare systems. This is already one factor connecting sex work to larger questions of labor markets, as this also affects precarious labor migrants in the field of agriculture, construction work, care and cleaning labor, who are also self-employed or seemingly self-employed. Recent reforms in labor and social security legislation enabled this limited access to social security systems and ultimately labor exploitation. Hence also the title of the presentation and the research, Precarious Freedoms, as participants were caught in a tension between promises of freedom and mobility within the European Union predominantly, and also structural precarization. There are no reliable statistics on the demographics of sex workers in Germany. However, it can be stated that a large part of sex workers are non-German citizens, and a significant portion of them come from the east of Europe, mainly Eastern EU member states. This makes a discussion of the realities of migrant sex workers from the east of Europe very relevant, yet this discussion is often very polarized and based on stereotypes of Eastern Europe, painting particularly Eastern European women as naive and helpless victims, which makes it easier to ignore the broader structural problems enabling precarities and exploitation. This discourse also prompted my research. Between 2017 and 2018, I conducted 14 months of ethnographic fieldwork in Berlin, including participant observation at an area for street-based sex work, bars, strip clubs and brothels, as well as narrative biographical interviews with 45 people, some of which were recruited through online platforms, additionally to meeting them at the places mentioned before. The participants were mainly cis women, and most of the participants were between 20 and 40 years of age and came from Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Russia, and Ukraine. Given the heterogeneity of participants, there were many, many differences among them, but given the time frame of the presentation, I will focus on the most important commonalities. I will start with a quote from a participant I call Susanna, a cis woman in her early 30s who grew up in Hungary, but had moved to other West European countries and had been working as an escort for a few years when we met. Asked about her experiences with doing sex work around Europe, she said, "Being a whore and then also Eastern European, is of course something stigmatized. But I would never admit that I'm from Eastern Europe. This caught my attention, as generally often with sex work, the assumption is that being a sex worker is the most stigmatizing aspect of sex workers' lives. However, as Susanna and others would elaborate, being seen as Eastern European sex worker meant that they would be paid less in comparison to, for example, German sex workers, or that clients would assume that they are particularly obedient, caring, or in the words of another participant, that, quote, clients think that they can do anything with me, end of quote. These assumptions about character, sexuality, and availability of research participants, which resonated with both ideas about Eastern Europe being less emancipated, as well as histories of sexual exploitation of Eastern European women in Germany, they were also associated with embodied features. This was highlighted, for example, on online platforms for sex work, where sex workers were also classified by type or origin, which did not relate to the actual origin where they would, claim to come from, but rather specific bodily features such as skin color, language accent, dressing, and makeup. The fact that Susanna could choose to admit whether she was Eastern European highlights that it is, in the words of Alexander Levitsky, an ambiguous racialization, which can be negotiating, depending on how well research participants could fit into ideas of white, middle class, Western European ideas of Europeanness. And here it also has to be said that all the participants of this research could be positioned within whiteness to different degrees, but it did not include people who were racialized and non-white. So among the participants, for Susanna and others who, for example, attended university, had a variety of language skills, and could adapt to certain middle-class norms, they could avoid being seen and recognized as Eastern European. Others, however, who, for example, came from very precarious socioeconomic backgrounds or had little access to education, had limited to no option to navigate this racialization. It was, however, not limited to sex work. In other jobs in Germany, they were equally subjected to precarious working conditions as Eastern Europeans. Kasia, a cis woman in her early 30s, who had moved to Germany shortly after finishing school and had been supporting herself by sex work, cleaning, and other jobs, said the following about her opportunities and choices on the German labor market. I did not want to go cleaning for €5 anymore, to destroy myself. That is why I preferred this job, by which she meant sex work. This sentiment that other jobs were also precarious and damaging to them was shared by many participants, as Eastern Europeans, classified through accents and appearances, but also passports or ID cards, they were delegated to highly gendered and precarious field of labor, such as cleaning or care work or construction work. Questionable work contracts, long working hours, physically demanding working conditions, and sometimes also sexual harassment and sexualized violence were present in all those jobs. And many participants shared the opinion that in Germany, it was not a question of whether or not to be exploited in the labor market, but which kind of exploitation one has to experience. In this context, sex work appeared as a viable alternative for income generation, as it promised less working hours with more pay and more flexibility. Again, this does not mean that participants understood sex work as a good job. Some of them did, but all of my interlocutors acknowledged that exploitation, violence, and physical and mental harm are also very present in the sex industry, and some of them had also personal experiences with it. Yet, for some, it was still an alternative to other jobs available to them. So to summarize, the experiences of migrant sex workers from the east of Europe in Germany are strongly shaped by the racialization as Eastern Europeans, and particularly its gendered and sexualized dimensions. This became very apparent in the sex industry, but was by far not limited to it, as they also experienced racialization and precarization in other jobs, and also in interactions with healthcare services, authorities, or in the housing market. And these multiple experiences of marginalization, discrimination, and precarization were connected to the racialization as Eastern European, and also created further or exacerbated existing vulnerabilities as they experienced as sex workers. It would be therefore short-sighted to limit analysis of the experiences of migrant sex workers from the east of Europe to an also necessary critique of the sex industry. Rather, it highlights the need for a broader perspective on racialized labor hierarchies and subsequent precarization of racialized labor racialized workers and their bodies in the German labor market. And here, since I'm not there, I will end with some shameless self-promotion, as this presentation is based on a book I recently published in German. So for those of you who read German, you can find it under this link. And also, since I will miss all the coffee breaks and so on, feel free to reach out via email if you have any further questions, which we cannot address in the discussion now. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention and look forward to questions.
Thank you, Ursula. Could you describe in more detail how you gained access to the field, and how do you feel as a researcher or woman during your fieldwork?
Of course. Thank you for the question. Short answer, how I gained access is patience. I only mentioned it in passing, but as you're probably aware, sex work is a highly stigmatized area where there's also a lot of suspicion about researchers and journalists, which often, put in the same category. And I also have to say, rightfully so. So it's not a place where, you just send some emails and you get a lot of replies. Here it was an advantage to do ethnographic fieldwork, which allowed me to, stay there, meet people regularly and, build rapport, gain some trust and eventually have conversations. But also patience is necessary, in engaging with certain criticisms people have about research on sex work. And, taking the time of addressing those questions and not just go in with like, oh yeah, I do this research and it's going to be great or whatever. And how I felt as a woman, well, there were some situations that were a bit uncomfortable, so to say, but I have to currently compare it with my more recent research, which often made me feel much more uncomfortable as a woman because I was mostly with men. And in this field, in research on sex work, being a woman allowed me to enter spaces where, for example, clients wouldn't go. So I, for example, didn't even have so much contact with potential clients as I would rather sit in a brothel, for example, in the brothel kitchen instead of somewhere else. And yeah, it is a highly gendered field. So sometimes if I go in, the assumption is I might also be a sex worker. But for me, it was mainly a priority to clarify to other sex workers that, I'm not a sex worker and I don't share this experience with them. Yeah, I hope that answered it a little bit.